Hello, and welcome to YogaHub podcast, where we bring you conversations with some of the world's leading yoga and movement educators. In this episode, I'm chatting to the legendary Leslie Kaminoff. Leslie is one of the world's leading authorities on biomechanics and anatomy, and he's authored several super influential books on anatomy and yoga. In this episode, we talk a little bit about Leslie's background with the practice, his relationship with his own teacher, T.K.V Desikachar. Leslie also shares a little about his thoughts on training programs, the future of yoga, and also the importance of a breath-centered approach to the practice. We're very lucky to have Leslie visiting us for a series of workshops from the 28th to the 30th of March. You can find out a little bit more information in the description below, but this should be a super insightful weekend for both students and teachers alike. Thank you for taking the time to tune in. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Leslie. All right, so Leslie, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to come on and have this conversation. It's really lovely to get the chance to talk to you and pick your brains a little bit. First and foremost, how are you feeling today?
Today I'm feeling okay. The new year has gotten off to kind of a quiet start for me because I decided to spend the month here with my partner Lydia on Cape Cod instead of in New York City, where I usually can be found working and conducting my private practice. So it's been a quiet month, so it's been nice.
Quiet is good. I imagine a lot of the people listening to this podcast will be quite familiar with your work because I think it's safe to say you're probably one of the most influential teachers in terms of particularly anatomy, but I'd say yoga in general of the last few years. But for anybody listening who maybe isn't too familiar with your work at this moment in time, I think it'd be nice if we begin by giving you a few moments to just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, maybe a bit about your life before yoga and your career in teaching. And I'm sure this could be a podcast episode in and of itself. So feel free to go into as much or as little detail as you would like to share at this moment in time.
Sure. Well, one of from the benefit of being able to look back on the last, 46 years or so that I've been teaching yoga is to be able to kind of get a big picture, and to connect my own personal experience with sort of the wider trends that we've seen in the development of what we now call the yoga industry. I took my first yoga class in 1978 when I was 20 years old in New York City. And, I got very quickly involved in the organization that I first studied with, the Shivananda organization. And at that time, they were really responsible for training more yoga teachers than any other group in the world. Because they have a worldwide organization and teacher trainings that happen all over the world, all across the year. And so from there, I started working with them and very quickly rose through the ranks because, well, I knew how to do things. I was trained in stagecraft from high school, like stage manager type stuff, working in theater and music and things like that. And so you sort of rise to the level of your competence in these ashram situations where they just need things done all the time. And so I ended up with more and more responsibility and ended up traveling to India early in 1981. And then I became a Swami with them. It's funny, I'm wearing orange today, but, back then I wore orange all the time. And they sent me to Los Angeles, actually, in 1981 to run the yoga community there. And even though I stopped being a Swami after less than a year, having discovered that it really wasn't my path, I did stay on with the organization for a bit longer and then eventually left Sivananda and started off on my own. And that's where I was introduced to sports medicine. I started working at a place called the International Sports Medicine Institute in Los Angeles. And this is where sort of the bigger trends connect with my own personal history and experience, because at that particular time in Los Angeles, there was all of this buildup to the Olympic Games in 1984. And because I was situated in this world of sports medicine and athletics and, sort of bringing yoga and flexibility training and things like that into the work I was doing at the International Sports Medicine Institute, a lot of this was coming together in the wider world as the fitness industry was kind of inventing itself. You know, there was no real fitness industry before the like early to mid '80s as sort of a nationwide and worldwide, really cultural phenomenon. And so I kind of saw all of that coming together right at ground zero from where we were in Los Angeles, working our way towards the 1984 Olympics. And about 10 years later, actually, in the early to mid 90s, is when yoga itself became an industry, when this more athletic style of yoga was being practiced and taught more widely. All of it was, of course, influenced very strongly by the Ashtanga Vinyasa practice that was coming out of Mysore at the time. And so when the health clubs saw that you could get a workout and sweat and really challenge your body with yoga, it became a very powerful sort of cultural phenomenon. Um, and we saw this really unusual moment, which is hard to imagine now looking back for younger people that are, you know, have been trained as yoga teachers and trying to find work teaching yoga. At that time, the demand for yoga teachers far exceeded the supply, um, which, you know, you're smiling. It's like, yeah, well, that hasn't been the case for a while since the rise of teacher trainings. But the ironic thing is, because of that, um, certain people jumped into this gap between supply and demand and started offering things like weekend-long yoga teacher training courses, which was a brilliant business move, you know. But it kind of got folks like me, who were involved in this like as a lifelong pursuit of something deeper and more serious. We got folks like us thinking there's got to be some kind of minimum number of hours that one should take training a yoga teacher. And so a bunch of us got together and sat down over a series of meetings, which is now known as the era of the ad hoc committee, that came together and came up with the 200 and 500 hour standards, which eventually completely reversed this trend of supply and demand, producing far more yoga teachers than the market could ever absorb. And so, you know, this is what I say is the benefit of looking back at the big picture over the course of my life and the life of what we now call the yoga industry. Somewhere in between, you know, those two eras of the fitness industry and the yoga industry developing is when I met my teacher, Desika Char, in 1988. And that became a key turning point for me in my understanding of what I was doing. And, you know, one of the motivating forces that arose for me was trying to understand anatomically, because I had developed a strong interest in anatomy from my originating with my work with just teaching yoga, but also with the sort of biomechanics that were involved in understanding things like sports medicine and body work and biomechanical analysis, things like that. Um, I wanted to understand why Desika Char's methodology worked so differently and so much better for me personally. I wanted to understand all that on an anatomical level, but there was really nobody involved in Desika Char's teaching tradition that was as obsessed with anatomy as I was, and so I had to sort of develop these answers to my questions on my own, because he didn't teach from a Western anatomical perspective. You know, he received the teachings from his father, Krishnamacharya, very much in the traditional way, and it was kind of up to me to bridge those two worlds of the sort of energetic anatomy of yoga and the more structural perspective that we get in Western anatomy, and that's something I'm still doing. So
Is
that's as brief as I can be, and sort of taking into account my own personal path. and sort of the bigger picture of where we find ourselves in the yoga world at the moment.
And you do seem to have lived through a pretty pivotal moment in time in the yoga industry, as we can call it, to sort of see it at the beginnings and where it sort of moved to now as, you know, a global phenomenon. I think it's okay to say. So there's a few things I'd love to ask you just from that brief little introduction. But the first thing that would really interest me, so yoga in 1978 in New York, what was that like? First of all, how did you find it? Was it very different to what we practice now, or is there still similarities? And what was it that kind of drew you into it? What was it that kind of caught your interest?
Sure. Well, I went to my first class at the invitation of my father, actually, who was studying yoga at the Shivananda Center in New York City at the time. He himself was going through kind of a midlife crisis. He realized that he never subconsciously planned to outlive his father, who died of a massive heart attack at the age of 47 or so. So he found himself, you know, outliving his subconscious expectations of his own lifespan, and decided to turn his life around in a number of ways. And one of those was studying yoga. And so he invited me to my first yoga class. And what got me really, and I think this is true for a lot of people, was the shavasana. Um, you know, I mean, I could tell you every posture I did in that class because Shivananda teaches the same class. Um, so to answer part of your question, is yoga practiced and taught differently today than it was in 1978? Not at Shivananda. They they really do stick to their traditional class structure. Of course, in the greater world of yoga and has developed, absolutely things have changed. But what makes yoga yoga, I think, is something that's constant, because it's a coming together of the mind and the body through the vehicle of the breath. And the thing that really got me hooked was what I experienced in my first ever uh, final relaxation, which was relaxing really for the first time in my life in an intentional, conscious way. Um, and that prompted me to sign up for a beginner's course. And then the beginner's course led me into the following summer, where I signed up for my teacher's training course up in the headquarters of Shivananda in Canada in the summer of '79.
Yeah, I wasn't there, but my guess would be 1978 New York. It doesn't sound like a very Shavasana kind of place in terms of like the
No,
wider
the
context.
city was a mess. You know, I mean, if you watch the movie Taxi Driver, you'll get a sense of the flavor of what New York was like in the '70s. Um, it's a it, tonally, it's a pretty accurate description, even though it's highly stylized. Um, but yeah, there were only a few places to go for any kind of yoga in the '70s in New York. Shivananda was one of them. The Integral Center, which is kind of a sister organization to Shivananda, was another. There were just a handful of people. I mean, you could look in the yellow pages back then. Do I need to explain what the yellow pages were? Or
We might be safe. I think potentially, yeah. My
yeah,
guess would be most of our listeners might have a sense of it. Yeah.
right. Well, you could go into this book that listed all the businesses, and the pages were yellow. And under yoga, the column would be about that long from top to bottom. And at one point, you could pretty much personally know just about everybody that was listed there, because it was such a small sector of offerings. Of course, that's changed now, but it was very much a carpeted floor, incense burning, Sanskrit chanting, very traditional hatha yoga kind of environment that I found myself in, which is what you'll still experience if you go to a Shivananda class anywhere in the world.
And did you? So your father was obviously getting an interest in yoga, but for you at that time, I think you said you were 20.
Yeah.
Had you started to get interested in those kind of like spiritual practices, or was it something that was very new for you? Or
I was interested in alternate ways of thinking and alternate philosophies. I was reading books back then like The Tao of Physics by Fritjof Capra, and reading different philosophers, Eastern philosophies. Hermann Hesse, Siddhartha was kind of a staple of people of a certain generation back then. So things like that. And so I was drawn as much into that world by the embodied experience of physical relaxation and of just basically inhabiting my body in a different way, um, but also the sort of alternative ways of thinking. Um, I read Swami Vishnudevananda's book, The Complete Illustrated Book of Yoga, and he was the founder of the Shivananda organization, and he was at the time sponsoring symposia and lectures, bringing in some of these alternate thinkers. One that Fritjof Capra presented at in New York was sponsored by the Sivananda organization. And I began reading other books like The Medium, the Mystic, and the Physicist by Lawrence Deshan, and Stalking the Wild Pendulum by Yitzhak Bentov. So these are sort of, underground, at the time, underground classics in alternate ways of thinking about reality, which led me deeper into some of the more, I'd say, classical philosophies associated with yoga.
And from there, you said you spent a bit of time as a Swami and left after, or stepped back from it after a year because it wasn't for you.
Yeah.
For anyone who maybe doesn't know, what does being a Swami involved, and what part exactly was not for you?
Well, I was quite young when I took my vows. It was 1981, so I was 22, about to turn 23. And you take vows. It's like becoming a monk or a priest. And the three fundamental vows of Swamidom or sannyas are poverty, obedience to the guru, and celibacy. Um, and the thing that they don't tell you, they should have a manual, that kind of warns you what's going to happen when you announce to the world that you're renouncing all of these things, is that the world says, oh, really? Okay, let me send all of these things back at you 100 times stronger than you ever experienced and see how well your vows hold up. Because that's just karma, so in the context of the Shivananda organization, when you become a Swami, you become upper management, right? And so you assume a lot of responsibility. In my case, it was running this small yoga community in West Hollywood in 1981. And so even though I was technically bound to my vow of obedience to the guru, who's the one that sent me into this posting, once I arrived there, I was in charge and everyone had to listen to me, because I was the head Swami. And I was handling more money than I'd ever seen in my life. I was managing the finances of this community, paying the rent and doing the purchasing and buying groceries and, doing all of that. And so as far as poverty is concerned, I was the person in charge of them. It wasn't my money, obviously, but I was handling more of it and had to gain skills in handling money, more than I ever had at that point. And as far as the celibacy is concerned, there is apparently nothing more attractive to members of the opposite sex than someone that has announced to the world that they've taken a vow of celibacy. And so, as this young 23-year-old, in a very visible position, running a center where people come and put their bodies into different shapes and do breathing differently than they've ever done, and it becomes a very charged kind of environment, as I'm sure you're aware. And so that came back at me a lot more strongly than I'd ever experienced either. And even though it was the celibacy thing that got me out of being a Swami, it was the obedience thing that got me out of the organization, because at a certain point I was ordered to return to the East Coast, from Los Angeles, and become staff at what that time was the Siberia of the organization, which was the ranch up in the Catskills in upstate New York. And I refused the direct order to leave Los Angeles, and stayed on in LA after leaving the organization, continuing to teach yoga. And I moved in with a woman who had become my girlfriend at that point, who was an athlete, who was my connection to the Sports Medicine Institute. Um, and so I'm glad I stayed, because that's where a lot of the things that I do today really kind of took form for me, because I got to be a fly on the wall of this very um, dynamic environment when I started working at the Sports Medicine Institute.
And when you got into the sports medicine, you were saying that you were still teaching yoga. Did you continue, I guess, as your education in sports medicine expanded, did you continue to teach and practice yoga in the same way? And I guess I'm curious as to how, do you feel that your experience with yoga maybe gave you a slightly different insight into sports medicine than maybe someone who hadn't had that experience, I guess, from a sense of embodiment, maybe? And how did your experience with sports medicine begin to change your approach to your yoga practice and teaching?
Sure. Well, let me answer the second part of the question first. My experience at the Sports Medicine Institute, which included working next to the X-ray station where everyone's full spine X-rays were put on a light box, front and side views of people's spines, scared the living shit out of me, and I stopped teaching yoga, because I was horrified to see what people's spines actually looked like compared to what the drawings and books I'd been studying looked like. And I imagined those spines doing all of the things that I had been teaching in these asanas. Keep in mind, the Shivananda sequence is the first major asana in the sequence after the sun salutations and the breathing is headstand. Headstand, shoulder stand, plow, bridge, fish, in that order, right off the bat, and then you do your backward bending, forward bending, whatever. And I was terrified that I was crippling people. And so I completely stopped teaching yoga for a period of time after getting a sense of what people's actual anatomy looked like. And I thought, okay, so these are like the abnormal spines. They're coming in here because these are the people with problems, right? So we're seeing problem spines. And the doctor, whose job it was to mark up the x-rays, who was very generous in answering my stupid questions, said, no, just everyone's spines look like this. This is just what spines look like. The things in the books, those are just artwork. And so, that really, and I think a lot of people can relate to this, because I don't know if you remember, but like back in 2012, there was this article that came out in the New York Times called How Yoga Can Wreck Your Body. And it got a lot of attention because he quoted some hopped up statistics that have since been proven to be complete nonsense. But, he estimated how many people were being paralyzed by yoga teachers on a yearly basis by doing things like plow and shoulder stand and headstand. And a lot of yoga teachers around the world, particularly in the US, were really frightened by this and actually banned the teaching of things like headstand and shoulder stand and plow in their studios, for fear that they were really injuring people. Now, needless to say, you should be very cautious about teaching these things where you're doing weight bearing on the upper spine, and unless you're giving people individual attention to see whether it's even appropriate for them to attempt, and if they are, using props and blankets or whatever to make sure that they're not loading up too much mechanical pressure on these delicate structures. Obviously it's to be done with caution, but that's how I felt back in 1982 and 83 about teaching yoga to people. Now, I was eventually drawn back into it because they wanted some flexibility techniques for the athletes. And I happened to be a yoga teacher. And, I started completely disassembling the class sequences I had been taught to teach at that point, taking out some of the riskier things and leaving in some of the more useful things, and emphasizing stuff like, working on the balance of flexibility in around the hip joints and in the major muscles of the legs and so on, because we were working a lot with sprinters and runners and people like that. So I began focusing a lot more on the foot and the weight distribution in the foot. And that was based on some of the things I was learning about gait analysis and biomechanical, um, observation. So yeah, I completely stopped teaching, disassembled it, reassembled it in a way that was appropriate to the populations I was working with, and my ever increasing understanding of what actual human anatomy looks like. So
It's yeah, I've read that article. I wasn't actually practicing yoga at that time, so I've no recollection of coming out or the impact. But I have read that article just in other kind of bits of research that I've done, and I think most people get into teaching yoga because they just want to share the thing that's made them feel a bit better, and they want to help other people feel a bit better. And the idea that this practice could be destroying people's bodies is obviously terrifying. And as you said, the article, I think you were saying, has been disproven in years since, or maybe the
yeah, the
extreme.
author of the article, William J. Broad, was they were publicizing his book, which was about to come out, about the science of yoga. And I did the original review of that book on Amazon when it first hit the market. Um, and they were uh, it was brilliant marketing for the book. Let's put it that way. And it got a lot of people to pay attention to certain things that we had been talking about at the Breathing Project, the studio I was running at the time, for quite a while. That you need to put attention to safety. You need to make sure that people are doing practices that are appropriate to their age and their condition, and a bunch of other factors. So it was kind of a come to Jesus moment for a lot of people that just were unreservedly sharing these practices, many of which were designed originally for younger people in fit, healthy bodies. And so the issues, and this is what I've said in the review of the book, the issues that he raises are valid and should be spoken about. To do it in this sensationalistic way with bogus, statistics that are meant to just get people's attention and perhaps frighten them, probably, questionable ethically, and scientifically. But it was a good conversation to be having, and one that, as I said, we had been having for years up to that point.
Um, with your experience, and I know this is going to be a difficult question to answer in some ways, because as you were saying, I think one of the issues with how yoga can be taught, which is not necessarily to do with the practice of yoga itself, just more so the delivery system of group practices, of trying to share things with a group of people that might have a wide range of experiences and capabilities and even interests and motivations, that that kind of more prescriptive yoga that would suit the individual can be tricky to find sometimes. But in your opinion, with your experience, what are some, let's say, in the interest of like safety and also efficiency to a certain degree, where do you feel like the let's say the most common ways yoga is taught is still lacking in maybe some of its like biomechanical understandings? And where do you feel, if there was if you're able to kind of like just with the sweep of a brush, like kind of upskill a few certain approaches, what would that be?
If I were in charge of yoga, how would I
Yeah,
change it?
exactly.
Yeah, first of all, I think that's a job that nobody should want to have. But I would say I can speak personally, and this goes directly to a lot of what I was inspired by my teacher's approach, Desika Char's approach. I would say that the breath should really be a major part of what we're doing right from the beginning. And there are systems, perfectly wonderful systems of yoga that treat breathing as a fairly separate topic. In the Iyengar tradition, for example, the topic of breath is pranayama, and that is something that one only approaches after a certain level of mastery of asana has been achieved, right? So it's not like they're asking you to pay attention to how you're breathing in asana right from the get-go. Now, in Desikachar's approach, the breath is there right from the beginning. And he would say things like, if what you're doing in your practice is so intense that it causes you to lose connection with your breathing, you should reconsider what you're doing, right? So the breath is sort of an internal barometer for how well you're staying connected with what you're actually doing in your body. And I think that approach, more than anything on a sort of technical or methodological level, is something that I think could help a lot of people in avoiding some of the more, I'd say, risky uh, things that they're doing. Now, you could counter what I just said with, well, yeah, but what about Ashtanga? I mean, that's famous for producing injuries, and they're talking about breathing, right from the beginning, because they're doing bandhas and they're doing ujjayi and they're doing all, the drishtis are part of it, and so on. And I would say, well, yes, and there's breath and there's breath. There's listening to what your breath is telling you and telling what your breath what it should be doing. And I think anyone that's worked at all with their breathing can understand the distinction between those ways of bringing the breath to the center of what you're doing. But people will do what they'll do. You see, that's the thing. Yoga is a highly self-selecting field. You will be attracted to what you're attracted to based on who you are, what your constitution is, what your needs are, what you're trying to accomplish in your life, and you'll pursue it up to the point where it's perhaps no longer serving you. And there's always something else that can come in. I mean, look at how popular yin yoga has become, over the last decade or two, and that's a natural reaction if you think about it, to the very yang kind of yoga that has been very popular for the last few decades, of people being very active and sort of, hot vinyasa in their practice. They just want to chill the hell out and, slow down at a certain point and not do so much movement and spend a little more time in each asana. One of the things I loved about the Shivananda approach is you get to do shavasana in between every asana. Then you get to do a really long one at the end of the whole practice. So it's a much more sort of energetic experience of feeling what each pose has done to you, because you have a reference point after each pose has been done. And you can get to feel, oh, this feels very different than the last time I was in Shavasana before I did this or that pose. So, I think in terms of an individual's experience in yoga, we'll always seek balance to whatever imbalances that we've created in maybe pushing too hard, or moving too fast, or not paying enough attention to the breath or the alignment or whatever. The thing I like about the niche that I found is that what underlies all of it, regardless of what style or tradition you study in, is the anatomy and the breathing. And by bringing things back to certain irrefutable, non-controversial facts of anatomy, we can build our understanding from a very, very solid foundation.
And you've mentioned a couple of times your teacher, Desikachar. And I've heard other people talk about his teachings on other podcasts, and read in articles and things. And as a teacher and a person, he seems to have a really seems to have had a really profound impact on his students. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit as to maybe what made his approach to yoga different or unique, or even if it did, or maybe just even how his delivery was maybe different or unique, and how and why that had such an impact on you personally.
Sure. Well, I'll talk about the broad strokes of my understanding of his approach. If we're not going to brand his approach with a label, you know, and just describe it in as few words as possible, what I've come up with is individualized, breath-centered yoga. And I would put yoga with a capital Y there, because his grounding in yoga is very traditional in the sense of how he learned it from his father, because it's rooted in the teachings and principles that one finds in the philosophy of yoga, primarily in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. But individualized breath-centered yoga, with individualized first, as important as the breathing is, as I mentioned earlier, to his approach, because it is quite literally the connecting principle between the mind and the body. If you're, for example, dealing with an individual for whom too much focus on the breath is not appropriate, and there's plenty of people like that, they just get anxious if you ask them to focus on their breathing, right? Then you would not focus on the breathing, you'd focus on something else, because that's what that individual would need. And I think that accounts for the power of Desikachar's influence on his students, is that he related to them as individuals. You know, even if he was addressing a large group of people, he would design practices with so much self-inquiry built into them that you always landed in those practices in a very individual way. And he made a lot of space for that in the way that he taught. And so for me personally, when I first encountered him in 1988, I was still very much the former Swami from the Shivananda organization. I had been experimenting with my own approaches and understanding anatomy, and I had my own studio in New York at the time, and my own way of kind of bringing breath more and more into what I was teaching. Before I met Desika Char, I was very focused on the breathing. But his approach to breathing, and this is going into the technical side of it a little bit at this point, was the complete opposite of what I'd been doing. The full yogic breath, as everyone knows, is here, then here, then here. You know, the three-part breath. And that I had been steeped in that perspective from my very first yoga class, and that's the assumption underlying what I'd been teaching at that point. Well, Desikachar's approach was very much the inhale starts here, then it moves here, then it goes here. So he had been called the yogi who breathes upside down when his teachings first were spread more widely. And I resisted that mightily as long as I could when I first encountered him, because I was so invested in the way that I had been practicing, the way I'd been teaching, and the way I'd been teaching other people to teach. So there was a lot at stake for me over this, you know, method. But when I finally tried it, it absolutely, well, it wrecked me at first, but it absolutely eventually transformed my understanding of so many things, including how to integrate the spine into the movements that we were doing. But that was a very strong influence on me in trying to understand anatomically why, sorry, I'm getting a call, why one approach was working so much better than the other. I needed to understand the anatomy of it. And to this day, I'm still sort of immersed in that inquiry. And as a final personal thing, Desikachar was the most skilled observer of the human being I ever met or am likely to meet. And so it was impossible for me to feel anything other than absolutely naked when I was in front of this man. Naked in the sense that I knew he was seeing all of the things that I had become convinced I was good at hiding, you know? And yet he did not base his interactions with me on any of that. He proceeded from the premise that I could find the answers I needed within myself by redirecting my questions into very deep self inquiries. And that is something that I will be forever grateful to him for, because he could, you can just destroy someone's sense of themselves with just a sharp comment or an observation of, some of these things that we're seeing in people. And yoga teachers know that we become very good at seeing things about people that they can't see about themselves, and you can turn it into a power play. You can turn it into a cult if you want. But he never did that. He never did that with me. And so that's sort of become my role model in the ways that I interact with students, is coming from this place of confidence that if they're given just the right inquiry or the right question to their question, that they can find the more powerful answers for themselves, instead of just being spoon-fed something that's pre-digested, or you know what someone else has said through the centuries in a text or a book or a teaching.
I would imagine that most people listening to this podcast would probably kind of, I guess, share your sense of interest in those different approaches to breathing. But for someone who maybe, like, if you were to say, there was this huge, big shift for me because I was thinking belly, ribs, chest, whereas he came along and said chest, ribs, belly, I imagine some people would probably answer me like, who cares? So for someone who's maybe not as well versed in these kind of topics as you would be, how would you characterize that shift, and why was that shift for you so impactful?
Well, it was impactful because it was so different from the pattern I was stuck in. And as a teacher and a teacher of teachers, I was stuck on so many levels by identifying with all the. See, if you're into this yoga thing just for your own practice and your own well-being, and you're not a teacher or a teacher of teachers or someone that writes books that teachers of teachers use to teach people how to teach, which is me, um, your identification, your ego isn't as invested in your patterns or your preconceived ideas about how something should go, and it's like, oh, that's a different way to breathe. Here, let me try that. Let me see what that feels like. That's what a yoga student would have done with that, and they wouldn't have had the complete breakdown that I had, you know. Um, but regardless of whatever level you're invested in this thing we call yoga, as a student or a teacher or a teacher of teachers or a guy that writes books, um, and then talks about it on podcasts, you know, the main reason to learn a new way to breathe is because it challenges your old way of breathing. That's called tapas. That's a key element of yoga practice. Desikachar would always say that our practice needs to be a little more clever than our habits, and if you've been practicing something long enough that your yoga practice is now being conducted on a habitual level that doesn't require a lot of thought, that doesn't require a lot of focus to maintain, it's time to switch things up and challenge it. And he had all sorts of simple yet powerful ways of challenging the status quo. One of them is to reverse the direction of breath as it's traveling in your system. Now, I'm not here to suggest that the way he taught is more correct than the bottom to top breathing. It's just different. It's a technique, and there's no single technique that's the right way to be breathing all the time. But there is a correct way to do the techniques. And so that's an important distinction that we need to hold, A technique isn't a technique unless there's a right way to do it. Otherwise, it's all bets are off and just do what you feel like and who cares, you know? That's not enough structure to create transformation for people because we're just going to do whatever we do and we're not going to change anything. So there's a right way to do techniques, but there's no technique that's the right way to be breathing all the time. And I think that's the trap that some teachers fall into when they teach, say, the belly breathing and say, okay, that's diaphragmatic, that's yogic, that's correct, that's proper breathing. What will happen to a student is they'll be transformed by that at first because it's so different from what they've experienced. And maybe they're really using their diaphragm in a new and powerful way compared to what they've been doing before. But then they'll get stuck in that, right? And then stuck is the problem. Getting unstuck is what the practices are for.
And as you were saying, you were quite influential in the development of the 500 hour training programs, which
I was one voice among many, but I may have been the first person to do the back of napkin calculation of the 200 hours because I was just analyzing what they taught at Shivananda over the course of a month. You know, it's like I was just adding up the hours a day we spent in philosophy or anatomy or practice or whatever, you know, and then I was timesing that by 6 because we got one day off a week, and then timesing that by 4 for the month. And the number of hours actually came out to almost exactly 200. And so I still have that piece of paper somewhere. But there were other conversations, other influences. There was a lot of people that went into this discussion. Yeah.
That's still quite a claim to fame, though. You could auction off that napkin for charity, I'm sure.
Or infamy, if depending on your perspective. You know, yeah.
Well, that's what I was interested in asking you, because obviously now with the proliferation of trainings across the world and the pros and cons that kind of come with that, and you will hear, you know, a lot of people, I would say maybe, but backlash is not necessarily the right word, but people questioning the 100-hour, 500-hour sort of system. Yeah, and I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on it today. Do you still think or do you still think it's a good approach to training people to be yoga teachers? And again, a very hard question to answer in lots of ways, but for you, what is it that would make like a very good 200-hour training?
Well, something I've been saying almost from the get-go, right after I resigned from the ad hoc committee before it turned into the Yoga Alliance, is that 200 hours does not train a teacher. 200 hours trains an instructor. And there's a difference. You know, you have to start somewhere. And instructor training was the start that I had. You know, the Shivananda teacher training is really an instructor training. And if by instructor what we mean is somebody that's just beginning with the basic tools of a sequence and, you know, a sort of a dialogue to teach the sequence with, and a basic understanding of how to do this safely with a room full of people for an hour and a half. That's an instructor. You've been given a class to teach. You're not necessarily someone that can generate a class on their own based on your vast experience of teaching people. You know, an instructor is someone who has the tools to start to learn how to become a teacher. And the only way to learn how to do that is by teaching, is by getting yourself in front of a room full of people and having some words come out of your mouth and having them move their bodies in response and seeing what happens as a result. And you absorb that into your being, into your experience, into your understanding. And if you do enough of that, maybe after, let's say, 500 hours, which includes hours of teaching people in rooms or privately or on Zoom now, you know, there's some people that have graduated from these classes that have never taught a live room full of people. They graduated during the pandemic and they've only taught on Zoom, you know. So that we never thought that would be a thing back in 97 when we were having these discussions. You know, the fact that some of these hours could be done remotely over the internet, which was just beginning to become a thing for us back then. We never, in fact, it was us, it was yogaanatomy.net, the courses that we've had online for 15 years. It was my producer who had to have these conversations with the Alliance about how they should acknowledge hours spent studying online as part of their standards because they didn't have a policy. We had to get them to figure out what their policy was so people could claim the hours they spent with us online as part of their anatomy, right? So many things have happened that we could never have envisioned. So you have to start somewhere. And hours is one way of counting that people are present and receiving instruction and hopefully paying attention. It's not the only way. And the 200 and 500 hour standards were always meant to be a voluntary uh, sort of template for how to start the conversation about becoming a teacher. Because remember, there were people being trained in weekends back then, you know, and if we didn't know how many hours at the outset it should take to train a yoga teacher, we were pretty damn sure a weekend wasn't enough. And so, okay, so how many is enough? And it was just, what we put out there. Um, Now we have yoga therapy trainings that are a cumulative 1,000 hours, and people are asking questions about whether that's a valid standard. What about competencies? What about mentorship? There's all different sorts of models, and there's things we can do now on the internet that allow people to assemble modules of things that they're interested in a kind of a training for themselves. You can earn the equivalent of an MBA, in on your laptop these days. If knowledge is what's important to you and you're a self-motivated person and you can absorb information adequately from your computer or from transcripts or videos, why not? It's a free market. It's an open market on ideas. And the market has responded with all these different ways of doing it. In the end, you can't replace the personal attention from an experienced teacher who's breathing the same air as you. That's something that, in a way, all these other ways of delivering training have put a premium on that, especially post-pandemic. And so, I'm seeing a revival of interest in people that want to spend time with teachers, particularly people that have been trained by some of the people like Desikachar or Iyengar or whoever they've studied with, who are no longer around. They want some feeling of connection to these teachings that can only be transmitted in the more personal way. So, but we're having a personal connection here. And you're sitting in Dublin and I'm sitting in Cape Cod, and we're having a real life exchange about things that hopefully matter. There's nothing wrong with that.
What do you think Desikachar would have made of the online age? Do you think he would have embraced it?
He would have said that it should be embraced by the people who embrace it. He professed to having no say in what Westerners should do or should be doing. He explicitly told that to me in an interview I did with him in 1992 in Madras. I asked him to envision the future of yoga because I had invited him to keynote at a conference I was helping to produce for Unity in Yoga. 1993 is when we marked the 100th anniversary of yoga in America, because it was 1893 that Swami Vivekananda came to Chicago to the World Parliament of Religions. And so Unity in Yoga, the group that actually turned into the Yoga Alliance, was producing conferences back then. And so in lieu of him coming to America and keynoting at this conference, he consented to sit down for this rather lengthy interview. And so I asked him to imagine if he were at this conference addressing a room full of, say, 500 yogis coming from all over America and the world, about the future of yoga, the next 100 years. He said, the future of yoga belongs to people who are concerned about the future of yoga. And I'm an Indian, and I'm not qualified to speak for the values that would be pursued by Americans. And so he was very circumspect in making these sort of broad pronouncements that are supposed to apply to everybody. He was more interested in talking to me because he knew I was an American and I was one of the people organizing this conference. And so, in a way, he was empowering us to, have our own conversation that was relevant to who we are as Westerners.
And you've as you were saying at the beginning, you seem to have been present throughout this really pivotal moment in yoga, particularly in the West, that we can say, sort of being at the beginning of yoga emerging as a worldwide industry, and sort of seeing the changes over the course of your time in it. So if I was to be cheeky enough to ask you the same question, if you were to envisage a future of yoga, would you give me a similarly, wary of making sweeping statements answer, or would you be willing to do so?
I can say that as long as it remains free, yoga to innovate and to denigrate, it includes things like yoga booty ballet and hot naked vinyasa and doga and broga and goat yoga. It will be broad and shallow and deep and transformative. It'll be everything that people needs it to be. And yoga does not need to be protected from the free market by people who think they know better. Because, even if 1 in 1,000 people who go to a yoga class because of the prospect of a goat climbing on them or bringing their dog or being buzzed on beer or weed, even if it's that, if it's that what takes them, if that's what it takes to get them onto a mat, and if the person leading that experience at some point asks them to move and breathe and experience themselves in a way that they perhaps never experienced before, and they land in their bodies the way I landed in my body in my very first Shavasana, then yoga has done its job. And that person has an opportunity to go deeper, because there will always be people that are willing to devote their lives to it, to studying the philosophy, the methodology, the tradition of yoga. We're not hiding, and that's the other thing, with all the information that's available at our fingertips. I mean, someone that had a transformative experience in a goat yoga class can Google yoga, can get to the wiki page on yoga, and they're not going to find anything there about goats. They're going to find yoga. The information's not hiding; it's available to anyone that wants to find it. And so that's how I would answer that question. The field is going to continue to do what it's been doing. And look, I'm just being self-serving and practical here, because if you look at this at the overall yoga pie, the yoga industry pie, the tiny little percentage of that pie that's the tiny little sliver that nourishes me and my family as a percentage of the overall pie is minuscule. But I'd be a fool to argue against the overall pie getting bigger, because that's going to make my little sliver of it more nourishing for me, right? So yeah, let the pie get as big as it wants, because no one has the right to tell anyone that they can't attach the word yoga to this or that. As much as people want to be the yoga police, they're misguided. So that's what I would say.
I've really enjoyed talking to you, Leslie, and I feel like I could pick your brain on lots of things for much longer. But as we come to the end, there was one final thing I wanted to ask you about, which is, and in a few moments, I'll give you a chance just to give people the overview of what you're going to be offering with us when you're with us in a few months. But one of the workshops that you are leading is on chanting. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the benefits of chanting, and for maybe if there's anyone listening who hasn't kind of given it a go before, why it's worth keeping an open mind for a practice such as that.
Okay, well, one thing we won't be doing is chanting mantras to Hindu gods. So if there's that sort of reticence about, which I had in the beginning as well, um, I come from a nominally Jewish background where, there's this thing about idolatry, which is kind of, fundamental to people's outlook on things. So, I was very reticent about all the statues I saw on the altars and the posters with all the arms and this and that. But the chanting we'll be doing is not that. It's called the Om Workshop. And it really is using this very interesting sound of Om to explore how we anatomically produce these vibratory utterances that we call sound and language. Because the Sanskrit alphabet quite literally is a map of the human mouth, anatomical map of the human mouth. And understanding this diphthong, Om, as a phonetic sound that we can produce, stripping away the symbology and the iconography from it, in a funny way, returns us to the power of something like this sacred sound. And so it as humans who use speech, I find it very, very useful to explore a sound like Om from this perspective, because it can bring more clarity to how we use our mouths, to what we're doing when we make sound. And it can also sort of open a window into how to help people therapeutically who have issues with their breath, or maybe with their throat region or mouth or jaw or tongue. It also ties into some of the information that's coming out these days about vagal tone and some of the functions of the vagus nerve in producing what we call parasympathetic arousal. So all of this comes into play, and then will be a topic for discussion simply by focusing on this one syllable for a couple of hours.
Sounds great. And so leading on from that, I said you're going to be with us in early March for a series of workshops. So if you want to take just a few moments to give people a small overview of what you're going to be offering, what they can expect, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Well, actually, we're doing an additional workshop on the Friday evening. There's an introductory program, which can stand alone. Each of these can kind of stand alone as a self-contained thing. So if people can't make it for the whole weekend, they can pick and choose. But the Friday evening is an introduction to Desikachar's yoga, which appropriately is called the individual, the breath, the relationship, where I give kind of an overview of the uniqueness of his approach with some practice examples. And I'll also have a chance to show some rare video footage that I have of Desikachar teaching, because as we get further and further away from, the era in which he was alive and teaching, fewer and fewer people actually get to hear the man speak. And so I do have some rare footage that we gathered of him speaking about some of the core concepts of his yoga. So that'll be the Friday evening. Saturday morning is what I'm calling a core practice immersion, the central pillar of breath-centered yoga. And this goes into that sort of breathing technique that I was talking about, and how it relates to ideas like Sushumna and even Kundalini, which was a part of Krishnamacharya's teachings. So there's an anatomy behind all of this, and we'll kind of go into that. And again, with specific practices of breath and posture and visualization that help connect with that. The Om workshop that we mentioned is the Saturday evening. And so that'll be the exploration of sound, breath, and resonance and vibration, using the Sanskrit organization of sound as a template. Sunday morning is the most active physically. It's called what I call the Warrior Series. That's kind of a wake up vinyasa that I've been teaching for many years. That shows how you can do a strong breath centered vinyasa practice without putting any body weight on your upper extremities, which a lot of people need to understand how to do. If the only way you get from one pose to another is through down dog, up dog, chaturanga type vinyasas, that can have consequences to your wrists, shoulders, and upper extremities. So this is another take on how to do a strong vinyasa practice that doesn't involve that. And then the final one, the Sunday afternoon, is cueing callouts. This is where we really get to break down some of the language we use in teaching and see if there's alternate ways of cueing things. I also get to call out some language that just has turned into folklore at this point when we're cueing alignment, which really isn't anatomically accurate or useful. So it's a way of reimagining some of the language that we use when we're cueing asana. And this is of particular interest to teachers. So we talk about things like tucking your tail and squaring your hips, or hinging from your hips, or always keeping your spine elongated, or whether we should always use back bending to open the heart, things like that. So that's a fun and challenging discussion to have. So those are the topics that we chose.
I'm really looking forward to the last one in particular, because yes, I've kind of, I guess, just learned a little bit more about biomechanics from approaches outside of yoga. There's definitely, when I go back and look at some of these kind of traditional cues and stuff, it's a bit like, wait a minute,
Yeah,
why
right.
do we do that?
Why? Yeah. Why are we never letting people do spinal flexion? Or and there's reasons. I mean, there's a reason why it's become folklore, and it comes from a certain perspective and a certain aesthetic, really, in asana, which the way you make things look nice isn't always what serves the person practicing. Anyone that's ever posed for yoga photos knows that. So yeah, we'll have all those discussions. It'll be fun.
Also, on the topic of sound and reverberations, if we have time over the weekend, maybe I'll see if I can take you up. We have a park here in Dublin. It's a tiny, small little park. It's by a church in town. But in this little park, they have a humming stone. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of one of these before. So a humming stone, they're not native to Ireland. They've been found in different sites all around the world, but I think the oldest one they've ever found is something like 20,000 years old. And as the name suggests, it's this big slab of stone with a hole cut out in it. And you basically stick your head in and you hum. And whatever way the stone is cut, the reverberations of this sound really like vibrates through your whole body. And there's a theory that these were like a very early form of like ritual, that people would go to these stones and hum. And as you're kind of saying, as people start to like learn a little bit more about chanting and those kind of resonant sounds, this idea of like the vagal tone, and that this is like a very early version of people tuning their vagus nerve by humming into a stone. So I'll have to bring you up to visit it.
I can't wait. Yeah, definitely. We're spending a few extra days in Dublin to poke around, and we've never been to Dublin. I've taught in Ireland before, but just up in Belfast, and also on the West Coast in Lahinch, but never in Dublin. So looking forward to that. That's great. Yeah.
Well, we're honored to be having you. Really, really looking forward to it. And it was really great to get the chance to talk to you today. Definitely your approach has been a big influence on me in my journey with teaching. And you're a really great resource for any yoga teacher out there in terms of just learning a little bit more. So an honor to get the chance to talk to you. And as I said, really excited to have you over with us very, very soon. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I can't wait to see you in person when we get to Dublin.